Hey, everybody, wait, friends in the back. Can we hear me? Oh, okay, I got some waves. I got some waves. Hello, everyone. How are you? Welcome. It's been a few months. How many of you guys came on a walking tour this summer? Ooh, a lot of you. Ooh, okay. Well, I want to thank you guys so much for being here. My name is Patty. I'm the executive director of Chicago for Chicagoans. I also have to fix the sound, so I'm going to turn over this introduction to the incredible Olivia. Oh, sound's working? Okay, just kidding. Just kidding. Yes, yes, yes. We can hear. Yeah, come in. Come say hello. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Sometimes you'll see me introduce the speaker. Sometimes you'll see Olivia. Sometimes you'll see any number of our fantastic volunteers. If you guys are familiar at all with our organization, you'll know that we are entirely volunteer run, which means when shit hits the fan, please send me a very nice email about it. But thank you guys so much for being here. Chicago for Chicagoans turns 8 years old this year. Holy shit. And we're really excited. We couldn't have come all this way without your support. Again, we are all volunteer. We're entirely funded by individual donations. We actually had our best ever year in 2023, so this is a really exciting note to be starting this year on. Yeah. And we're a 501c3 nonprofit. We might even be sales tax exempt someday. We are really, really excited to present our lecture series for 2024. And it's my extreme privilege to be here kicking off the event and, of course, introducing our speaker tonight. Now, before we bring him up here, because I know you all know the man, the myth, the legend, Adam Selzer, I want to politely remind you that we are entirely funded by individual donations. So if you care to make a donation tonight, you can do so at chicagoforchicagoans.org/donate, or if you're here in person, give us cash. They take no fees. Or you can give us check or Venmo or PayPal or Zelle or literally any way you know of to convey money to us, we will accept. The only thing we don't accept anymore are kidneys. The black market just got too messy. And this year, our lecture series has a theme that we're really excited about. Every year, our lecture series has a theme, and then I goad all of our speakers into, cooperating with it. And this year, we decided on Chicago City of Influence. So over the next, 14 lectures, something like that, until April, we will be sitting here every single Thursday night telling you guys about all of the ways that inventions and creations and things that are so wholly Chicago that happened here affected the whole world, far beyond our borders. We are an incredibly influential city from, just to give you a little taste of what's coming from music, which we're discussing tonight, to LGBTQ activism, to women's liberation, to medical care, to candy, to poison control next week, to bicycles, to even me, who's going to later be in this series talking about sewage. There's a lot of ways that Chicago has developed things the rest of the world has copied, and that is really what the seed of this lecture series is all about. Most Chicagoans know that we have a really influential music history, so what better way to start off this series this year than to give it up to Adam Selzer, who's going to be talking about our musical roots today. If you don't know Adam, you should. He runs Mysterious Chicago. He does a number of incredible walking tours every year. He wrote the book on Graceland Cemetery, and of course, he donates some time to us every year because he's the best. So we're going to, without further ado, hand it over to Adam. Thank you, guys. Give him a nice warm round of applause. I'm gonna offer to give you this. Yes, microphone transfer.
Yep. Microphone transfer. Yeah. Yes. Put on this alligator clips. What? Oh yeah, I got pockets. Yeah. Okay. All right. Hello, everybody. Is the microphone still working properly? Okay. While I get situated, I will point out that, like a lot of historians, I'm not really big on commemoration. I don't really do a lot of posts that are like on this day in 1987 or anything like that. However, I did find out right before I came here that today is a very momentous, especially if you've ever worked in the ghost industry, today is a very momentous anniversary, January 11th. It would have been January 11th of 1984 that a young man walked into a roadside diner having just hitchhiked away in a semi-truck. And he walked in, and as directed by the driver, he said, "Large Marge sent me." At which point, everybody looked around at me and said, "Well, that can't be. It's been 10 years ago. In fact, tonight's the anniversary." And pointed over to the wall where there was a memorial to Large Marge from January 11th, 1974, 50 years ago today, which means that he was riding with... Oh, God! There we go. Okay. Now that we're situated. All right, so I hope everybody can hear me on the live stream. If not, I'm sure they will tell you in the comments. I'm not sure how well we'll be able to do the audio on the live stream, but I'm going to do my level best. Before I open today, I wanted to just briefly share a quick anecdote from little Steven Van Zant's recent autobiography. He's the guitar player for the E Street Band. And he relates a time in 1974 he came into the recording studio while Springsteen was trying to record 10th Avenue Freeze Out, and they were just having the devil's own time with the horns. Now, he had been arranging horns, so he just said, "Throw everything away, let me handle this." Sang out a horn part to the horn guys. They got it down in about 5 more minutes. And in his autobiography, he says, in a lot of the books, that was the day that Springsteen's manager said that I should join the band. And maybe he did. I don't know. We're all just making half of this shit up anyway, you know. I bring this up because a lot of the information that I'm bringing up tonight, I've tried to go to primary sources as much as I can, but that means a lot of 1950s jazz autobiographies. There may not be a less reliable source in the world than a 1950s jazz autobiography. Not just people changing things around for publicity, but also there are ghostwriters involved, there are editors involved. Sometimes people will go back to the original notes and the original typescripts. They find that there are entire sections that got changed between the writing and between when it got published. So we're doing the best that we can here. But our topic for tonight is how Chicago created all modern pop music. In a way. I could probably do a similar lecture to this in New York. I could maybe do it in New Orleans, but really not that many cities. Back in the old days, every train line ran through Union Station, and that's really sort of how things go in pop music as well. Everything runs through Chicago at one point or another. It's hard to find much of anything in music that doesn't have Chicago in its DNA someplace. So over the course of the evening, we're going to point out a couple of examples, just some of the basic history of popular music in Chicago. By popular music, I mean really just kind of whatever was popular at the time. It's really anything that's not classical. Our earliest example, are we okay here, Patty? Yeah, okay. One of the earlier examples we know about of music being played in Chicago, if you look on page 1, you can see this handsome-looking guy named Mark Bobine and the log cabin hotel that he ran right about at Wackerin Lake in Wolf Point, called the Sauganash Hotel. He was the landlord at this place. It was a hotel, and you could pay to sleep there, but you didn't get a bed. You slept on the floor, and you liked it. For an extra $1, you could rent a blanket, but if you fell asleep under that blanket, they would rent it to somebody else who was awake enough to notice. But Mark Bobine was famously played the tavern there. They had a famous catchphrase. Every time they had like an old settlers reunion later on, they would always come up, like crowd around like, "Say the line, Mark." His famous line was, "I keep the tavern like hell and I play the fiddle like the devil." So this would have been around the early 1830s in Chicago when it was just starting to grow. Now, at the time, Chicago's first celebrity, as it were, was a guy by the name of George White, who was the town crier. His job was to walk around ringing a bell, announcing when there was an auction, or especially if there was a lost child. He was, people remembered he would like make up a song or a poem about the lost child on the spot and walk around like reciting that poem until the kid had been found. A while ago, I saw a thing saying that there was a conspiracy in Chicago history to cover up the fact that George White was a black man, but I've never found a historical reference to him that didn't make a really big deal out of the fact. Usually there were some rather unkind references, but he and another guy, a guy by the name of Pete McHenry, who had escaped from slavery himself, when there was an auction, they would help drum up business by putting on a music concert outside of the auction hall. This would usually be, from what we have described, nobody ever wrote down a specific song that they did or anything, but they would always say it was old plantation type songs, plus some skits that sound very much like what would eventually be called a minstrel show. Only I think, hopefully they would not have been wearing blackface. It's not as though black performers never did in those days, but it's hard to find, it's hard to overstate how popular minstrel shows were in the 19th century. That was popular music for people. But Chicago, well, I should also point out, George White, we don't really know whatever happened to him. One reference that I found is in 1840, this is pretty well documented, that in 1840, he was, besides being the town crier, he was also just kind of a jack of all trades and handyman. 1840, we had our first official hanging in Chicago. A guy named John Stone was hanged out by the Indiana Dunes, and they decided that they should have George White function as the hangman. Now, 50 years later, Fernando Jones, one of the old guys who was around at the time, started saying that afterwards, George felt so bad about what had happened that he just took to the bottle and was not heard of much after that. It's the only reference I've had to what's come up, to whatever became of him, but really, if Fernando Jones is your source, you don't really have a source. Fernando Jones is a particularly unreliable guy who loved telling stories and was not one to let facts get in the way of them. There is a reference in a Galena paper that a man named George White had died in 1841. Might have been him. There were a lot of people named George White in those days, so it's difficult to tell for sure. But the first time I know of that Chicago had an influence in popular music that started moving beyond just within Chicago started around the time of the Civil War. Now, on page 2 of the packet is a picture of the Root and Katie Music Store. That was a musical publishing company. There was a guy named George Frederick Root who got his start writing minstrel show songs, but they didn't work out very well because he didn't want to write them in exaggerated dialect. He didn't want to write them on the same topics that everybody else did. So they weren't really very big sellers. But his brother started up Root and Katie Music Publishing in Chicago. He came here to work as a printer and a songwriter for them. And 1862, was the Civil War was getting underway, across the street from their office at the courthouse, right where City Hall is now, there was a big rally to get people to sign up to be soldiers. And in this, they had an awful lot of speeches, and it's interesting reading it. It was July of 1862. This is a couple of months before the Emancipation Proclamation, but half of the speeches were about the need to end slavery. This was not a formal goal of the war yet, but everybody knew what was going on. And one of the big showpieces of that rally was they premiered Mr. Root's new song, which was the battle cry of freedom. That became one of the biggest hits of the war. And rather than trying to take my chances on live stream, it is the Union forever, hurrah, boys, hurrah. Down with the traitors and up with the stars. We'll rally round the flag, boys, rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom. It's a big hit. Later, there was a reference. I did find an interview, like 30 years later, there was an interview with an old Confederate veteran who said, well, you know why the Union won. They had the battle cry of freedom and battle hymn of the Republic. All we had was the Bonnie Blue flag. Okay. I'll take it. A couple of other connections. He also wrote Tramp, 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 the Boys Are Marching, which is not really remembered today, but the melody became Jesus Loves the Little Children. So it continues on in a way. Two other people publishing similar things at the time. One is a guy by the name of Henry Clay Work came to work for him for a while. He came to work for him just as a printer, but as he worked with all of that machinery, you would hear all the rhythms of the printing presses and start thinking of songs of his own. He didn't have a piano, but he started writing down lyrics and thinking up melodies. Finally, he got somebody to help him write one down, took him to Mr. Root, and Root looked it over and said, kid, if you got more songs like this, you can quit printing. His most famous at the time was Marching Through Georgia, one of the other really big ones, while we were marching through Georgia. But what he's really better remembered for later on is parlor songs, the kind of songs that were starting to become popular, and especially as the Civil War wound down. One of his... I had this history book when I was a kid called The Vile Victorians. It was all about how weird Victorian England was. And as an example of what kind of songs they liked back then, they put in a song called Come Home, Father. This was a parlor song that was actually by Henry Clay Work, written in Chicago. They just couldn't find one maudlin and ridiculous enough that was actually from London. It's a song written from the point of view of a little girl who has gone to the tavern to try to bring her father home because her little brother is dying. The last line is, yes, we are alone, for Benny is dead. He is gone with the angel of light. And these are the very last words that he said. I want to kiss father goodnight. People liked to party in those days. But Another one he wrote that became a huge standard and is still well known today was My Grandfather's Clock. It's why we call big, tall chest clocks grandfather clocks. My grandfather's clock was too large for the shelf, so it stood 90 years on the floor, etc. There's some really great dirty versions of that, too, which are probably better known. What rhymes with clock? They can also be long. Also, The Ship That Never Returned, which became a lot of different folk songs. He's the man who never returned. We'll get to the great folk scare of 1963 later on. There was also a publisher at the time by the name of Will Rossiter who didn't publish anything memorable at the time, honestly, or write anything that memorable, but he will come up again. But also, George Frederick Root's son, William, was also writing parlor songs by the end of the 1870s. None of them that I have ever found were particularly good. But there is one that I'll sing the first verse of. It was called The Parlor is a Pleasant Place to Sit on Sunday Nights. I'm going to sing it because it comes up again later on. It went, the light is in the parlor, the fire is in the grate, the clock upon the mantel ticks out, it's getting late. The curtains at the windows are made of snowy white. The parlor is a pleasant place to sit on Sunday nights. Mm-hmm. It's a parlor song about parlors. Think how many blues songs are about the blues. Think how many ska songs are about ska. I'd say at least 1 in 3. But this is the only parlor song I know of that is literally about parlors. But another guy writing parlor songs at the time would become kind of a footnote in early jazz and blues history. If you watch the mini tours a lot, we've come up on this guy a few times. So in 1914, there was a reporter for Chicago Defender, one of the great black newspaper of the day. It was a guy by the name of Columbus Bragg. He was their drama critic. And one day in 1914 was talking about all the upcoming events, in between plugging the musical that he was working on himself, which was half the point of his column. But he talked about an upcoming benefit. He went and interviewed a singer named William Abel, about whom not much is known. And he said at this upcoming benefit, Mr. Abel will sing Curses by Paul Dresser, the first blues song. Now, Paul Dresser was a parlor songwriter who mostly wrote songs about mother and home and marching and stuff. You know, it was, if the Chicago Tribune had said that he wrote the first blues song, it would be hilarious. But this is the Chicago Defender's drama critic getting it from a black singer about 10 years before newspapers would really start to write about what the first blues song was. And by then it was always something by W.C. Handy. Now, Paul Dresser himself was not what you would call a blues man in general, but he has some Chicago connections. His brother was Theodore Dreiser, who wrote Sister Carrie and a lot of great Chicago books. He himself did write a song called The Curses that was kind of an urban legend within the vaudeville community by 1914 when this article came out. One thing we do know about Paul Dresser is that he really liked hanging out in brothels. In particular, there was one he hung out with in Evansville, Indiana, where he was seeing a madam by the name of Sal Davis. And after Sal Davis broke up with him, he started dating a burlesque queen named May Howard. They eventually married, but when May Howard left him, she left him with a dying baby daughter, a morphine addiction, and at least one sexually transmitted infection. So, yeah. So she left him, and some months later, the story went that he was playing a set of songs in some vaudeville house, playing a set of his own songs, and looked up, and there was May Howard, his ex, with her new husband, looking down and laughing at him. So in his rage, he improvised a song that eventually became kind of a standard. It's kind of hard to find the sheet music now, but there are enough references to it back then that it was clearly a bit of a hit. It was a song called The Curses, and it went... So when Judgment Day rolls round and you stand trembling there, I trust no baby face will greet you in your wild despair. But I'll be there to meet you, to tell you of a blow that you so cruelly struck and broke a heart so long ago. My curse will follow thee. My curse will follow thee. Now, musically, this does not sound like the blues at all. Except that a couple of people, when I've been playing this on mini tours, people have pointed out to me that last line, my curse will follow thee, appears to contain the devil's triad. This musical interval that became the root of an awful lot of heavy metal riffs. And it was apparently inspired a lot of superstition back in the medieval days. To call anything Paul Dresser wrote blues from a musical point of view is probably nonsense, except that in 1914, Jelly Roll Morton had just moved to town. Generally known at the time as a ragtime piano player, but there's actually a recording where he demonstrated to Alan Lomax exactly how he used to be playing around Chicago in 1914, jazzing up Paul Dresser songs. Specifically, he played a little bit of My Gal Sal. I'll play just a bit of that here. So it's probably significantly jazzier than Paul Dresser would have been playing it himself. My gal Sal. So it's possible that William Abel had heard Jelly Roll Morton jazzing up a version of that song, but I think more likely it's just kind of like, well, for once, this is maybe the only time in his life that Paul Dresser really sang what was in his guts at the time. More likely it's just kind of like if somebody said Heartbreak Hotel was the first emo song. It fits the bill in a lot of ways, but if the Curses is a blues song, then so are all those songs about women standing on the shore telling other young women never to marry, or songs from the point of view of a guy who's going to be hanged in the morning. Hundreds and hundreds of songs would count if we go by that broad of a categorization. I did see there was one article about this little blues footnote. One guy was absolutely furious, saying, well, Paul Dresser did not sell his soul to the devil, Robert Johnson did. Well, first of all, that would have been 20 years later. Second of all, Robert Johnson did not actually sell his soul to the devil. And third, if Paul Dresser did not sell his soul to the devil, it's only because nobody told him he could. Had he known that was an option, he would have been first in line from everything that we know about the guy. But in 1915, the year after that, Will Rossiter, the parlor song publisher that I mentioned a minute ago, published the Jelly Roll Blues by Jelly Roll Morton, which is sometimes pinpointed as the first real jazz song that was published. The sheet music calls it a foxtrot because they didn't have really anything else to say it at the time. But this was just about the time that the style of music that was being played down in Storyville in New Orleans, the red light district, was starting to spread out of New Orleans. This is where we get into King Oliver and Louis Armstrong when they came to town. Now, jazz had started to develop in New Orleans, but again, trying to find out exactly where everything came from can be very tricky. We usually credit a guy named Buddy Bolden as the father of jazz. He was playing around New Orleans about the turn of the 20th century. He was recorded a couple of times, but the recordings do not survive. A couple of people who played with him remembered making like wax cylinder recordings, but the company that did record them, like only one thing they ever recorded does survive, and it sounds terrible. So really we have to go by like secondhand by people who played with him and kind of were influenced by his style. We can get some idea. But both Jelly Roll Morton himself and Kid Ory both said that Buddy mostly copied his style from rag and bottle and bone merchants who used to play on tin horns as they went around in alleys collecting people's rags and bones. Like Jelly Roll specifically told Alan Lomax, rags and bottles and bone men would advertise their trade by playing the blues on wooden mouthpieces on Christmas horns. Yes, sir, they'd play the low-down dirty blues on those crest horns than the rest of the country had ever thought of. Louis Armstrong himself got to start playing those kind of things. So Buddy did play with a lot of other people. Among those was a guy by the name of Joe Oliver. Joe Oliver would later be known as King Oliver, and there were some other people who played with him who got jobs in a band called the Original Creole Band, or the Creole Orchestra. There are 7 or 8 different names that he used, but they started going on tour about 1911. There's some references to them playing at the Grand Theater at 31st and State in 1911, which might have been the first jazz performance in Chicago. Now, that band was never recorded, so we have to go by written accounts of what they were like, and from written accounts, for the most part, it sounds exactly like what George White and Pete McHenry were doing 100 years before, 80 years before in Chicago. They were dressed in plantation costumes. They did plantation-style skits in between the music. A lot of it was just old stuff like that. But that kind of got the idea of jazz music spread around. By 1917, that was a term that people knew. And 1917 was the year that New Orleans closed Storyville down. That shut down an awful lot of clubs and left an awful lot of musicians out of work and looking for a place to go. And an awful lot of them came to Chicago. including Joe Oliver, who was kind of the third generation after Buddy Bolden. He'd played with a guy named Fred Keppard, who had played with the guy who had played with Buddy Bolden. He was generally said to have kind of a similar style, only a lot more tricks, a lot more little gimmicks. But they brought Joe Oliver up to play at a place that at the time was called the Royal Gardens on 31st and Cottage Grove, about 1918. They started playing there. The first night he was there, somebody put a crown on his head and dubbed him King Oliver. Shortly thereafter, he got a piano player in the band by the name of Lillian Hardin. Now, Lillian had moved to Chicago herself as a teenager in 1917, a couple of years before, and said that coming up to Chicago from the South was like moving to paradise for her. All of a sudden, there was stuff to do. There were things to go, places to go to. And one day, walking down Straight Street, she came down to Fred Jones's music shop and looked at all the sheet music inside and saw there was somebody playing the piano and didn't think he was doing a very good job. So she came in and said, "Here, let me try that." So she tried it out, and the guy offered her a job at $3 a week playing sheet music to drum up business. By the second week, she had gotten up to $8 a week. Pretty good. People would keep on coming in to play piano against her, and everybody wanted to come see this young jazz prodigy that they talked about. And she would beat all of them at piano until the day that Jelly Roll Morton came in. Jelly Roll Morton just absolutely floored her with his playing in that store, and she said that thereafter I tried to play like Jelly Roll Morton all the time. But she got better and better. King Oliver eventually recruited her to come play in the band, and a couple of years later, Louis Armstrong joined. Now, Louis had gone along with Joe Oliver to the train station when he first left New Orleans for Chicago, and he himself had gotten his start as a kid playing on the tin horn. He had been more or less adopted by a Jewish family, the Karnofskys. They were a rag and bone collecting family, and he would ride around playing on a tin horn. He wrote in a memoir years later that was his first inkling that he had musical talent, that he would play on these tin horns and manage to pick out a little tune, eventually even got some lessons on it. People would gather around, and he realized he could make people happy by playing music. So he was brought in to play along with King Oliver, and idolized King Oliver to such an extent that he would have been happy playing second cornet to him forever. But then he married the piano player, Lillian. And Lillian was not about to be married to a second trumpet player. So she told him, no, you've got to move up and become first. She got him a job playing first trumpet for Fletcher Henderson in New York, then drummed up a job for him playing first trumpet with his own band back in Chicago, Louis Armstrong and the Hot Fives and the Hot Sevens. Got him a job paying $20 more a week, so he came back and she started printing up banners saying, "Welcome home, Louis Armstrong, world's greatest trumpet player." And she continued playing for life as well. She actually died on stage at a Louis Armstrong memorial concert in 1971. They had been divorced for years by then. There's probably a Paul Dresser joke in there someplace. It wouldn't possibly be in good taste. Let me check my notes here. So by this time, the Royal Gardens had become the Lincoln Gardens. They added a new dance technique. They got this thing that they called the ball of fire. It was a glass ball that would spread colored lights all over everybody. Cost them $5,000 in 1920s money. Said there were, at the time it was said there were only 3 like it in the world. So we could almost say Chicago invented the disco ball here. It sounds very much like a disco ball to me. But while they were playing at the Lincoln Gardens, while Louis and King Oliver were playing there, there was a group of kids from the West Side, a group of white kids. They called themselves the Austin High Gang. Jazz was still very new. This is an era when you'll go through the newspaper and see all these editorials about how jazz is the devil's music. Usually these articles get really racist really fast. And in particular, they said kids are going to be influenced by this music. They're going to start dropping out of school to go listen to jazz. But bands like these bands like King Oliver and Louis Armstrong's early bands, were starting to go out of style already by the end of the 1920s. End of the 1920s, the shows... clubs in Chicago that wanted to keep people coming in had to have much more elaborate reviews, a big, almost like a vaudeville set. A lot of the musicians in Chicago started moving out to New Orleans instead. Now, one guy who stuck around was Earl Father Hines, who started playing at the Grand Terrace down on 35th. He said that he would later say that Al Capone wanted to set up the Grand Terrace as like his playground. He later told Stud Circle, "Yeah, I knew Al Capone just as well as I'm talking to you right here." Sometimes Capone would come in, go to the manager, Mr. Fox, and say, "Here's $2,000, Mr. Fox, close the place." And the band would just be playing for Capone and all of his buddies. Meanwhile, a couple of people from his band, Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie, would be in the back, like practicing licks that would eventually grow into bebop. Another jazz musician who will come up later said in those days, Al Capone was the savior of the black musician in Chicago. His nightclubs employed hundreds. Louis Armstrong, Earl Himes, Jimmy Noon, all those guys had jobs because Capone made the managers get black musicians and black singers. I knew Al Capone, and I'm proud of it. Not everything that was going on in the jazz world was something we can be proud of. In fact, at the same time, you know what else was coming up was drugs. In particular, this is another thing. You know, there's a saying, Dilla's saying that if it's dope, it came from Chicago. In this case, dope specifically in the music industry. There's a guy by the name of Milton Mesro. He was of a Jewish immigrant family who lived on the west side. He lived around Division and Western, where he and his friends' favorite thing to do in the 1910s was steal cars. In those days, it was really easy to steal a car if you could get in, and they would steal it and like drive it for 3 blocks and then park it somewhere else. So like 3 block joyride, and then it would just be a trouble for the person to find their car the next day. But this got him sent to the Pontiac Reform Institute. While he was in Pontiac, he noticed that the black prisoners' music was a lot better. He started taking clarinet lessons and eventually insisted on being put in the side of the prison with the black prisoners. He felt a lot more comfortable around there. In those days, the Jewish neighborhoods tended to be right up next to the black neighborhoods. This is something you see over and over in this. After he got out, he started playing jazz music in, you know, places of ill repute. Also had stories about meeting Capone that may or may not have been true. But he specifically remembered one day he was at a club in between Gary and Chicago someplace, and a guy came up to him and said, "Hey, you ever smoke a muggle?" He handed him something that he said was called New Orleans Gold Leaf. It was marijuana. But this is what Mez said about the night that he played after he smoked some of that. He said, "I began to feel very happy and sure of myself. With my loaded horn, I could take all the fist-swinging evil things in the world and bring them together in perfect harmony, spreading peace and joy and relaxation to all the keyed-up and punchy people everywhere. I began to preach my millennium on my horn, leading all the sinners to glory." It's a funny thing about marijuana. All of a sudden, the world is stripped of its dirty gray shrouds and becomes one big belly full of giggles, a spherical laugh bathed in brilliant sparkling colors that hit you like a heat wave. All your pores open like funnels, your nerve ends stretch their mouths wide, hungry and thirsty for new sights and sounds and sensations, and every sensation when it comes is the most exciting one you've ever had. You can't get enough of anything. You want to gobble up the whole goddamn universe just for an appetizer. Does anyone know what strain this was? Like, to that. Maybe Ooga Booga Skywalker cake or something? I guess I want some. But he became known as the Mighty Mez. There was even a song, If You's a Viper. Viper is what you called yourself if you smoked marijuana in those days. He moved to Harlem and became almost like the Johnny Appleseed of marijuana up there. He is generally believed to be the person who turned Louis Armstrong onto marijuana, after which Louis Armstrong was seldom not high a minute in his life. But if you's a viper, when I dreamed about a reefer 5 feet long, the mighty Mez and not too strong, you'll be high but not too long, if you's a viper. It was almost a jazz standard in the 30s. A lot of people recorded that song. So, still going on in the 1920s, there was a music store down on the south side run by a guy named Lester Melrose. One day, a guy came in wearing a cowboy hat and introduced himself. He said, "I'm Jelly Roll Morton. I invented jazz." And Lester talked to him for a bit, found out that he could actually write sheet music, which a lot of the guys in the jazz scene at the time could not, so he brought him on as the house songwriter for a while. Then eventually got into the recording industry. He set up a makeshift recording studio up above Eli's Pawn Shop at 34th and State, which turns up in a couple of blues songs, specific references to Eli's Pawn Shop, which never shows up in the newspapers. It wasn't the kind of place that made the news. But up there, he would put people together. He would get a lot of people who were starting to come up from Mississippi at the time, playing early versions of the Delta Blues. But he would pair them together into bands. This was a kind of a new thing. He would record side after side, where he'd have one guy singing, a couple other guys playing other instruments. Then they'd rotate, so it would be somebody else recording. And he got really rich off of this. None of the musicians did. He would pay them strictly for the session, and that was it, which was just how music worked at the time. It wasn't strictly blues. It happened in every other genre as well. Nobody got a good record deal in those days. But over and over again, this was Bluebird Records, which was a cheap version from RCA that published what at the time people generally thought of as novelty music. But he brought in a lot of guys like Big Bill Brunzi, Tampa Red, Lonnie Johnson, Sonny Boy Williamson I, Big Joe Williams. Many of these guys played solo, but he kind of turned it into a band sound. One of them, usually they was known for doing stuff that they called sweet music, but one of their biggest hits, one that sold something like 7 million records, was one called It's Tight Like That by Tampa Red and Georgia Tom Dorsey. There's pictures of those guys in the packet. I'll play a bit of a clip of that. There's something like 7 million copies that sold. And right around the time Georgia Tom Dorsey was suffering from really deep depression. But then in his version of the story, one day he went to see a preacher, and that preacher reached into his mouth and pulled out a live serpent. And after that, his depression was cured. And he determined that thereafter he would only write religious music. And he did. He's generally now known as the father of gospel songs. In fact, he claimed to have coined the term gospel music. He didn't invent the form. What he did was he took the old, what he would have called Jubilee songs and added blues timing onto them. And eventually served 50 years as the pastor of Pilgrim Baptist, the musical director of Pilgrim Baptist Church, and is generally credited with the guy who got a lot of black churches to stop just trying to copy European music and bring in more of their own. There was a great quote he got from somebody saying, yeah, we get all of our style from New York. New York gets all of their style from Paris. Paris gets all of theirs from hell. So he also wrote several hundred songs for Mahalia Jackson, including Take My Hand, Precious Lord, which was Dr. Martin Luther King's favorite. It was played at his funeral. He had requested to hear it just shortly before he died. It was actually a good time for Georgia Tom Dorsey to become the father of gospel, because that hot style of jazz of the 1920s was starting to go out of style back in by the end of the decade. In the 1930s, things were we had the Depression, things were getting a little bit strange. A lot of the Chicago guys had moved out to New York and were just getting jobs in things like pit orchestras and Broadway shows. One of the guys who was bopping around bands in New York, one of the old Chicago guys from the Maxwell Street area, back when it was called Jewtown, was a kid who always tried to hang out with the Austin High gang, but they thought he was too much of a nerd running around in short pants. He was a little bit younger than they were, but that was Benny Goodman. So Benny was working in New York when one day he was hanging out at the Onyx Club, and a guy came up to him that everybody in the scene knew, named John Hammond, said, you know, Benny, a lot of this stuff is dying out here, as you know, but it's just starting to catch on in Europe. Why don't you come in and record some sides for me? And eventually Benny would marry John's sister. Eventually John would get him Fletcher Henderson's unused arrangements when Fletcher needed some money, and with that he kind of invented swing. So John Hammond, I got to get into a bit. He wasn't really a Chicago guy, but he was part of the Vanderbilt family. It's a big contrast. Benny Goodman was one of 12 kids in Jewtown. They grew up dirt poor. John Hammond grew up on the Upper East Side of New York. He was part of the Vanderbilt family. They had 12 kids at the Benny Goodman house. He had at least 12 servants in the house. But he would sneak away from boarding school to go up to Harlem and listen to jazz music early on. And after dropping out of college, he had enough money that he didn't need to worry about money, so he became a talent scout for Columbia Records. And here we kind of have to get into the concept of discovery. He's credited with discovering an awful lot of musicians, but usually these weren't people who were like on a humble hog farm singing on the porch or anything. They were people who were already big in one city, people who already had a steady gig. He himself would kind of disavow this stuff about discovery. Studs Terkel wrote at length about how he didn't like the idea of discovery because it was usually people who, it just meant that a white person had discovered them. And later on, Bob Gibson would say the same thing. If I hadn't discovered her, somebody else would have for sure. And I'd argue there's a little more to it than that, because there is a matter of, like, Billie Holiday could have been singing in a club in Harlem for a long time without anybody with any clout noticing. It does take in a career, you have to have the right people notice you and have the right ideas for how to market you, for how you are the right singer for the right moment, the right people to pair you with, the right people to combine you with. And that's true of pretty much anywhere. Certainly it's true that a lot of the cream will rise to the top anyway, but it could have taken too long if he hadn't found people singing there. So, and Hammond himself did not have a perfect record with this. In about 1960, when he was still with Columbia, he listened to a demo tape of a song. It was just supposed to be of the song, but he said, I want the singer. Who's that girl singing on that recording? We got to sign her immediately. And that was Aretha Franklin. So he signed her and did a few records with her, and I think her records on Columbia are terrific, but they could never really figure out how to present her at Columbia, what kind of material to get for her, and it wasn't until she went off to other record labels that her career really took off. But he'll come up again. Now, normally, he didn't really like working with white musicians too much. John Hammond would say white musician the way most people would say greaseball. But he did like working with Benny Goodman, who would eventually be his brother-in-law. Knew that he had, and also kind of saw him as a vehicle, because in addition to just trying to build people's careers, he also had a political agenda that he really wanted the white jazz bands to become integrated. And he thought that Benny Goodman would be a good vehicle for that. So Benny was kind of reluctant. Benny, having come from the poor side of town, was always a lot more risk-averse than John Hammond, who had all the money that he needed, even if things went wrong. But he was bugging. He was like, Benny, you got to start playing with more of these black musicians. And Benny would say, well, if I play in public with one of them, a jam session's one thing. If I play in public, I'll never work again. Neither will he. But in 1936, now if you watch the Mysterious Chicago live streams, we always open with those recordings from Benny Goodman playing at the Congress Hotel in 1936. Now, Benny had just become a huge hit, introducing the nation to swing in late 1935. The Congress brought him in to try to break the curse of the Congress Hotel. During the World's Fair in 1933, they covered this up at the time, but it came out the next year that there had been a dysentery epidemic at the Congress Hotel during the World's Fair of 1933. Dozens of people died of dysentery after staying at the Congress Hotel. The health department in the hotel covered this up until about the last couple of days of the fair. But throughout 1934, they had a pretty rough time of it. They brought in Benny Goodman to try to draw people back to the Congress Hotel, to try to repair their reputation. And throughout 1936, he was broadcast on the radio all over NBC, and effectively introducing a lot of people around the nation to the style that we now call swing music. Then in 1936, one day, John was listening to a little bit of the Earl Father Hines radio show that was being broadcast from the Grand Terrace all the time. And while listening to the Grand Terrace, he noticed, wait, that's not Earl Hines' style of playing. And it turned out, no, Earl was out of town that night, so they had his understudy. He had to make some phone calls to find out who this kid is. He's got a different style, and I really like the way he sounds. I think he could complement Benny really well. There was a piano player named Teddy Wilson. So they brought in Teddy Wilson. I've got to check my notes over here for a second. Brought him in and persuaded Benny to do a little bit of recording with him first. Then for the Easter concert in 1936 at the Joseph Urban Room of the Congress Hotel, and you can see within the packet there's a picture of several Mysterians standing around in what looks like a very ordinary hotel conference room now. But that was the Joseph Urban Room at the Congress Hotel. So Easter concert in 1936, it was announced in the press a little bit that Teddy Wilson was going to play a bit at the intermission of the Benny Goodman show. And it didn't end up being just Teddy. In the intermission, Benny, his drummer Gene Krupa, and Teddy Wilson all played as a trio, which is often pinpointed as the first major jazz performance by an integrated band. Took until 1936. People didn't really even notice it at the time. There were a couple of little brief mentions in the press, but it definitely wasn't the kind of blow-up that Benny Goodman was expecting. So the next year, he and John Hammond went out to Los Angeles and found a Chicago musician named Lionel Hampton just tearing places up with vibraphones. Now, Lionel would later say that he came to Chicago with his family in 1919. His uncle had gotten a job as a bootlegger. Always said he was working for Capone. He was the guy who had the quote about how I worked for Capone and I was proud of it. Said it was very ordinary in the morning for him to just pick up the phone and say, "Good morning, Mr. Capone." What he also said is there was no way a kid with music on his mind in Chicago wasn't going to be into jazz and dreaming of playing in a big band. But it was kind of sad to think about all those black and white musicians going around admiring each other and playing off each other and jamming together privately, but knowing they couldn't be seen together in public. But John Hammond and Benny Goodman talked him into joining not only as a quartet along with the trio, but also becoming a full-time vibraphonist in Benny Goodman's band, and that effectively was the first integrated major big band. Now, they were a little bit worried when they first took the band to Dallas. After they had saved the Congress Hotel, they brought him in to save the Dallas World's Fair in late 36, 37, and again, nobody really noticed it too much. It was all just very quiet. Hampton would later say that this was really on Branch Rickey's mind a decade later when he decided it was time to bring in Jackie Robinson to play for the Dodgers. Whether it really was on his mind or not, it's something Lionel Hampton said anyway. Fourth in the quartet was Gene Krupa, who was also a Chicago kid, a son of Polish Catholic immigrants. Started out playing with Thelma Terry, who played in the band at Colosimo's Cafe. She is sometimes said to have been the first woman to lead a band that was not an all-woman band. Eventually ended up teaching knitting in Savannah. But one day at the Congress Hotel, John Hammond said he was getting tired of hearing Benny night after night after night, so he says, I'm going to go hear what else I can hear. Now, he had rigged up his car with a state-of-the-art custom 12-tube radio, which I guess is a lot of tubes. He could pick up stuff from all over. He'd pick up the Chicago stations when he was in New York. And one night, being tired of Benny Goodman, he went out to the parking lot and turned it on. And way at the left end of the dial, he picked up a little station out of Kansas City that was broadcasting a band out of the Reno Cafe. He's like, this is more improvisational. This is something entirely new. I've got to go to Kansas City immediately. So it was Count Basie playing with Lester Young on the saxophone. So he brought them into Chicago as quickly as he could. He wrote them some letters, but they didn't know who he was, so they kind of ignored him. Eventually, he just drove all the way to Kansas City, said, Lester, I've got to pair you with Billie Holiday. I've got to get recording immediately. Brought them up to replace Earl Father Hines at the Grand Terrace. This introduced Lester Young to recording. Lester Young is also the guy who invented a great deal of the jazz slang. If you've ever said that you dig something, if you've ever called something cool, I'd probably use both of those today. That's Lester Young's own made-up slang. So in 1938, John Hammond decided to stage a concert in New York at Carnegie Hall called Spirituals to Swing. His idea is he would take the whole progression of music, show like old people playing spirituals from back in the 19th century, get some Delta blues people in there and show how it progressed all the way up to Count Basie and his orchestra. He had heard some Vocalion records of Robert Johnson and thought, this is who I want to be the Delta blues guy. He sent the Vocalion scouts down and they found, no, he was just killed in a bar a couple of weeks ago. So instead, initially he planned to just like play some Victrola recordings of Robert Johnson. He wrote about that in an article at the time. That doesn't seem to have happened at the actual show, so he replaced him with a guy named Big Bill Brunzi. Now, Big Bill Brunzi has a past that's a little bit mysterious himself, partly because he told the story himself different ways at different times. His mother had been born into slavery in 1855. Never once really saw him play. She would never cross the threshold of a place where guitar was being played. She still thought that sort of thing was sinful. Now, he started out playing the fiddle himself, but he gave it up to be a preacher. But one day a guy came to the door while he wasn't home and told his wife, well, we really want your husband to play some fiddle for us for a couple of days. We'll pay $50 and give you a new fiddle. And by the time he got home, his wife had already spent that $50. So he kind of had to take the gig. Now, in 1920, anyway, that's how he told the story anyway. 1920, he moved to Chicago, worked odd jobs like a Pullman porter before switching to guitar. His early records on Bluebird were kind of unoriginal and didn't sell well, but over the course of the 1930s, he started improving. Now, recordings of him, such as exist, he kept on playing until his death about 1960. Recordings don't really reflect the amount of influence that he had, especially in the folk circuit. He toured with Studs Terkel and Win Strachey promoting folk songs. It's one of those things that not that many people heard him, but just about everybody who did bought a guitar. It's kind of like the first Velvet Underground record. Only 40 people bought it, but every one of them went out and started a band. So, now, in 1938, the same year as the Spirituals to Swing concert, Big Bill Brunzi also recorded a song for Bluebird. That doesn't sound promising. We're just getting to where this gets really cool, too. All right, so Muddy Waters moved to Chicago in 1943. He had been working as a sharecropper, but one day he realized he was making 22.5 cents an hour. Other people in the fields were making 27. So he went to his boss and said, I want to make 25 cents an hour. The boss went ballistic, so he worked a couple more days, then called in sick and moved to Chicago. In Chicago, he said, I got off that train and it looked like it was the fastest place in the world. Cabs dropping fares, horns blowing, the people walking so fast in big buildings. Now, over the course of the 1940s, something like 75,000 black people moved from the Delta up to Chicago. At the time, it cost $11 to take the train from Memphis or $16 to take it from New Orleans on a 24-hour ride. By 1943, he still said like Robert Nighthawk had told him he was going to Chicago to play music. It sounded like he was going to the moon. But by that time, everybody in Mississippi knew somebody in Chicago by then. So he lived with his sister for about a week, found a job almost immediately after working here. Pretty soon he had his own 4-room apartment working in a container factory and started playing blues music on his guitar at rent parties in exchange for whiskey. He also started going to parties at Tampa Red's place. The guy who had recorded It's Tight Like That. Lester Melrose in Tampa would have parties at their place at 31st and State all the time. And there he met a lot of the other Chicago blues guys. A lot of guys like Lonnie Johnson. He met Big Bill Brunzi, was a big influence on him at the time. Started playing a lot on Maxwell Street, which he always referred to as Jewtown later in life. But the trouble was, playing in these low-down bars and on Maxwell Street, people couldn't hear you that well. So one day he went to the music store and bought a pickup for his guitar. Now, this isn't to say he invented electric guitar. You could buy the materials to do it at the store at the time. But he's generally thought to be the first who really took advantage of the new kinds of sounds you could get by electrifying your guitar and turning it into what we would start to call the Chicago blues. Now, Lester Melrose thought his style was a little too ordinary, but he signed to a new outfit called Aristocrat Records, which had been started by Peter and Leonard Chess. Later, they would change the name of the company to Chess Records. So they first got Muddy a gig. They'd had their scout had gone to see him. He was said, "Hey, you're that Muddy Waters guy, right? Why don't you play something?" And Muddy said, "Well, I don't have a guitar, but Lonnie Johnson over there does. Hey, Lonnie, can I borrow your guitar?" And Lonnie was like, "No." Nobody borrowed Lonnie Johnson's guitar. And finally the scout said, "Listen, Lonnie, he just wants to play it. He's not going to eat it." So he played him something, got a deal with Chess Records. The first day he got called in to record, he was out working, driving a delivery truck. But word got back to him that Chess wanted him to come in and record, so he got to the nearest telephone, called the boss and said, "Boss, they just found my cousin dead in an alley. I've got to go." So he went to record like that. The first thing he recorded in 1948 was called I Can't Be Satisfied. It was an instant smash. Basically the first example most people would have heard of electrified Delta blues. Now by that time he was starting to play backed by an entire band. He had a harmonica player, he had drums, he had piano. This is really what crystallized the sound of the Chicago blues. The trick is, though, that the Chess brothers thought we've already got a formula that works, why mess with it? It wasn't until a few years later that they started recording his entire band. Pretty soon they'd added blues greats like Willie Dixon and Howlin' Wolf to the Chess Records lineup, and Chicago blues had what would really be a fairly brief heyday in the early 1950s. Then in the mid-1950s, one day, a kid from St. Louis and his friend came up to Chicago just to check out the music scene in the Bronzeville area. And they went around just from club to club like amazed. These were all these people that they'd heard of, they'd listened to on records, and they'd copied their records playing in St. Louis, but there they actually were in person. And towards the end of the night, they noticed a marquee, the big name in lights, Muddy Waters Tonight. And this was the kid's favorite. He went in, caught the end of the set, managed to corner him after the show, like Mr. Fan, I'm a big Waters of yours. And then he said, "My name's Chuck Berry. Do you know who I could talk to about getting a record deal myself?" And Muddy, I guess, must have been in a really good mood. He said, "Yeah, go see Leonard Chess. Leonard Chess over at 47th and Cottage Chess Records. That's the guy you want to talk to." So Chuck did, just walked in, and Mr. Chess later said he just seemed like such a businessman that I told him, "Well, fine, get a tape, and you can send it on in, and we'll see what we can do." So Chuck had been playing a big mixture of stuff like Chicago-style blues and also like hillbilly stuff and Western swing. He was really into Western swing. And so we made him a tape that had one particular song called Ida May that he had adapted from an old song called Ida Red by Bob Wills and the Texas Playboys. And when he brought in the tape, well, Muddy listened to it and said, "This is something new. This is going to change everything. You've got to record this." And Mr. Chess said, "Well, it's good, but it sounds a little too much like Ida Red. You got to at least change the name." So he changed it to Maybelline. It still had the same. It still had the same melody, the same opening lick. So I'll play first a bit of Chuck Berry stuff. This is where it gets wild. All right. So yeah, generally credited as it's people will argue about what the first proper rock and roll record was, but that one tends to get cited quite a bit. But the verses, he had taken the melody, and the opening lick he had taken the just kind of played an electric guitar version of the fiddle version of Ida Red. I'll play just a bit of that. Listen to the verse here. Well, here's the wild thing. Did you hear what the words were in the verses there? But the words in the verses were, I'll just sing it. I don't know how well they can hear it on the live stream. They cannot. Sorry, everybody. You can't hear that, but the verses went. The light is in the parlor, fire's on the grate, clock on the mantel ticks out, it's getting late. The curtains and the windows are made of snowy white. The parlor is a pleasant place to sit on Sunday night. It was word for word. Every verse of that song is just copied and pasted from The Parlor is a Pleasant Place to Sit on Sunday Night by Frederick W. Root of Chicago. He just added the chorus, Ida Red, I'm plumb fool about Ida Red, which I think makes it an infinitely more interesting song. And then Chuck took the licks and the melody, completely rewrote the lyrics to make them way more interesting than that, about motorbating in his car, chasing Maybelline, the unfaithful lover. That's really what set Chuck apart, is his lyrics were so much more interesting than a lot of what was going on at the time. So much more creative, so much more going on. So that's a very... a kind of an unhighlighted connection of Chicago within the DNA of rock and roll. I've kind of lost my place here, going back to try to sing that again. Oh, good. But all right, so rock and roll had been born. There's a couple of other couple of other connections. Lester Melrose one day saw a guy singing on the street. He had come to town to sing with a gospel group, but then got stranded in Chicago. They couldn't get a fare for the train back. And he was singing on the street and, according to some accounts, living in a packing crate under the L tracks. But it was Arthur Big Boy Crudup. So we brought him in to record one of the songs he had written, That's All Right, Mama. That's All Right, Mama, which would later be Elvis's first regional hit anyway. But stranger than that, in 1953, a guy named Alvin Krolik walked into the Pulaski Avenue police station and confessed to a bunch of recent burglaries. He said, I just feel bad about this. I've been living over at 3255 Eastwood ever since my wife left me. I'm feeling really bad about this. I want to confess. And eventually the judge let him off the hook for all of this. But a couple of years later, he was shot to death, apparently trying to rob a liquor store. But the guy who ran that liquor store had shot so many people that I get a little suspicious that maybe this guy who ran the liquor store just likes shooting people. He had previously worked for Pancho Villa during various revolutions. But Alvin Krolik's story was then retold in the newspapers. There was a widely circulated article that talked about the autobiography that he had been writing, that talked about, when you think of me, think of a man who walked to the end of a lonely street. Now, guitarist Hoyt Axton's mother, May Boren Axton, saw that article and thought, the end of a lonely street. Good line. And was inspired thereby to write Heartbreak Hotel, which was Elvis's first #1 hit. If you look at page 15 in the packet, that's 3255. That is where Alvin left after his baby left him. So that's Heartbreak Hotel from a certain point of view. That's skipping ahead one page. Back on page 14 is some ads and pictures from the Offbeat room. That's Studs Terkel hanging out in this place, the Offbeat. This is a place over on Granville and Kenmore. The building still stands, though it's currently vacant. Now, Studs Terkel was a radio DJ who in the 1950s played a little bit of everything. He played a lot of Big Bill Broonzy, helped get him recorded towards the end of his life, and really helped kickstart the folk boom. He also liked to hang out, along with Big Bill, at a place called the College of Complexes downtown, which still operated without having their own premises until fairly recently. It was an intellectual hangout. People would go there for debates and to play elaborate word games. A friend of mine who was in Chicago in the 50s said that was the only place in the city where a minor couldn't get a drink. They didn't want minors in there to spoil the intellectual tone of the place. There was a sign on the door that said, minors admitted only if accompanied by their grandchildren. But playing around the College of Complexes, Big Bill met Ken Nordine, whose voice you have definitely heard in commercials, but was also doing word jazz. But besides doing word jazz, which he continued doing around Chicago till his death just a few years ago, he was also the voice that says, poof, there goes perspiration, on thousands and thousands of voiceover commercials at the time. But he met a folk singer there by the name of Bob Gibson, a young Pete Seeger disciple. So Ken Nordine decided to open his own place, the Offbeat Room, in Granville and Kenmore, brought in Bob Gibson. Now, I love the ad for that Ken Nordine is going to read poetry and suspense stories to people. And then Bob Gibson would be playing folk songs. And eventually he instituted a no-talking policy at the club, which was a very new idea at the time, really blew a lot of people away. But, this is like you come in here to hear the folk songs and you listen to the folk songs. One day in 1956, they advertised it was going to be a 12-hour folkathon, in which Bob Gibson and several other people would take turns playing for 12 entire hours. But it was a smash hit, and a music promoter named Albert Grossman happened to be there and thought, wow, this folk music stuff is going to catch on. I got to get into the folk music business. So he opened a club downtown called the Gate of Horn that was down in the basement. Bob Gibson was a regular there. Shel Silverstein, his best friend, would come in and hang out and got the idea that, hey, I should write songs too. So he ended up writing like A Boy Named Sue, One's on the Way, The Unicorn for the Irish Rovers, You're Always Welcome at Our House, just about every Dr. Hook and the Medicine Show song. Lots, you can go on and on about everything that Shel Silverstein did. But one time while they were playing at the Gate of Horn, Bob Gibson and Albert Grossman went traveling around. They went to Boston and heard about this new singer, Joan Baez, who was singing at a coffee shop. And they brought her into the Gate of Horn. Then at the Newport Folk Festival, Bob brought her on stage to sing and kind of introduce her to the world, and she became a star almost overnight. Roughly the same thing happened when he found Judy Collins singing over in Aspen, Colorado, of all places. And she would go on to make people familiar with the works of Leonard Cohen later on, with her hit recording of Suzanne. Now, Bob especially said, listen, I don't like this idea of discovery. Saying that I discovered Joan Baez is like saying I discovered the Grand Canyon. I might have found her before other people did, but if I hadn't done it, somebody would have done it. And that's possible, but by the time somebody did, it might have been the whole folk music craze might have been over by then. But Albert Grossman, after a couple of years at the Gate of Horn, moved on to New York with his new folk music experience, decided to put together what we would now call an industry plant, a prefab band. He got 3 folk singers together to form Peter, Paul, and Mary. And then discovered John Hammond's latest discovery. John Hammond had still been working for Columbia. The jazz boom was over. He wasn't finding any new jazz people, but he had just started assigning folk artists. And this is where you really see that the guy had more insight, was able to spot talent that a lot of people wouldn't. He had signed Bob Dylan based on his singing. No, I think it's a brilliant move. I think there's not a more interesting singer on the planet. I think the man is a singer's singer, but he signed him not on the basis of his writing. Dylan had been playing little coffee shops around New York. He'd been playing at parties with Woody Guthrie, who was too ill to sing for himself. Though there is a story that Woody, who had been in the hospital with Huntington's chorea for years, he would come out, these people would bring him out would like sign him out to have parties now and then. And Woody apparently said of Dylan, like, that kid can sing it. He may not make it with his writing, but he can sing it. It's funny. So Grossman met Dylan and decided to become his manager, negotiated a better deal with him, arranged for Peter, Paul, and Mary to sing Blowin' in the Wind. That became a huge hit. Meanwhile, back in Chicago, Bob Gibson was still playing mostly like taverns and stuff, but he did a show at the Latin School for the students. And young Roger McGuinn was so inspired that he went out and bought a guitar. Later on, he would join the Limelighters, and then he would start the Byrds, have more hits with Bob Dylan songs, and kind of introduce the nation to that jingle-jangle sound of folk rock of the 1960s. 1965, Dylan went electric at the Newport Folk Festival, backed by Chicago people, the Butterfield Blues Band, which was Howlin' Wolf's rhythm section, along with Mike Bloomfield and Paul Butterfield. So more Chicago. It was a Chicago blues band backing him at the time. Meanwhile, around that same time, 1961, at a train station in Kent, England, a couple of kids who knew each other from just hanging around, they'd seen each other at the train station before, got on the train together, and one of them was, hey, you've got a Howlin' Wolf record. I didn't think anybody else knew who that guy was around here. And that was Mick Jagger and Keith Richards. A couple of years later, they would start the Rolling Stones based on their shared love of Chess Records. They would record there in 1964. There's a well-worn legend that when they showed up, blues was so out of style in the United States by then, they showed up and found Muddy Waters painting the ceiling at Chess Records. Chess Records insists this was not true. Keith Richards himself would say it over and over again. So I really don't know who to believe. Honestly. While they were recording, Chuck Berry showed up and made sure they were recording a couple of his songs, for one thing, then said, swing on, gentlemen, you sound good if you are sounding most well if I do say so. Now, at the same time, Bob Gibson had a song called Chicago Cops. came out about the early 1960s. It was right around the time of the Summerdale police scandal, where it turned out the cops at the Summerdale police station had a whole burglary ring going. They were actually employing burglars that they had caught to go burgle stuff for them. Like around World Series time, they all wanted portable TVs. And they had like hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of stuff over a few years. Gibson on the record says, you know, it only takes 2,000 crooks to spoil the reputation of one honest cop. One of the crooked cops from a few years before was a guy named Elmer Valentine, who worked as a cop around this neighborhood. Later on, when asked, like, a reporter asked him, what kind of cop are you, like a beat cop, a detective? He said, I was a crooked cop. He very openly admitted this. He would pull people over, search their cars, and if he found like an unlicensed pistol or something, like, oh, you got a pistol here, I could take you in. Or you could give me $500. This eventually got him in trouble. Around the same time, he got indicted for it, and his wife left him, so he would later say, well, that's when I kind of went nuts. But he had a side gig running nightclubs for the mob here in Chicago in the 50s. So having already had that experience when he was finally forced out of Chicago under fishy circumstances, he went to Los Angeles and started the Whiskey A Go-Go. This is where we get, for one thing, go-go dancers. They brought in the Doors as the house band and gave them their start. They gave Frank Zappa his start. Later on, bands like all of the Motley Crue, Guns N' Roses, all of the 80s hair metal bands all came through the Whiskey A Go-Go scene. So Chicago's kind of responsible for that, too. Or crooked cops from Chicago, anyway. Plenty of them, yeah. One more that I can't talk too much about because it's not a scene that I know that well, but we're also the birthplace of house music. Now, in 1977, disco had been big for a while in 1977, but by 1977 it had gone mainstream and was getting pretty dorky. Now, when I was a kid in the 80s, it was just generally agreed that disco was the most embarrassing thing that had ever happened. There were lots of jokes about this in, like, sitcoms and cartoons and stuff. It was always, the same image of the white guy singing Disco Duck. It really did seem to me like the most embarrassing thing that ever could have become popular. But, there was still a market for it. The Warehouse on South Jefferson in what is now the West Loop. It was mostly populated by gay men of color, with the DJ Frankie Knuckles. Now, black queer clubs in Chicago go way back. Like right next door to Tampa Red's apartment where all those parties were going in the 1930s, there was a place called the Cozy Cabin that was a black drag club. They would advertise it as the strangest club in town. It was their star attraction was a guy named Dick Barrow who performed as Sepia Mae West. They actually had a theme song for the Cozy Cabin that miraculously even still survives. There are a couple of pictures of it. But at with disco kind of going stale, at the Warehouse, Frankie Knuckles, the DJ, was experimenting with editing long disco breaks, taking out the song parts and just having the instrumental portions, adding sound effects, adding different beats of his own. Eventually, other DJs started just making their own tracks that were just rhythm tracks on the old Roland synthesizers. Their idea wasn't less about the songs, more about keywords and sounds that would connect to the audience and trigger various specific emotional reactions. It's difficult to name a famous house song that everybody in the room would know. It's not really a style that lends itself to singles very well, but it did influence other pop songs. You can hear a lot of house influence, and the one they cite the most is Vogue by Madonna. That came up quite a bit. The Warehouse became a landmark in 2023, and just a couple of months ago, Dylan opened 2 shows in Chicago covering Born in Chicago by the Butterfield Blues Band, who had backed him in Newport 65. And then a couple of Muddy Waters songs and a Howlin' Wolf song as well while he was at it. So that brings us right up to the present day. Is the live stream still working, Patty? Yep. All right. It's working. I tried to just sing rather than play too much stuff. But I guess we can go for questions at this point. Have I gone over time? I have, okay. I had no idea how long that one was going to run. I know I've been fairly thorough. Yeah. It's not generally the kind of thing that would have made the news if it happened. But, it was generally known that people would kind of jam together informally sometimes. That's what Lionel Hampton was talking about. He would see people, playing off each other and jamming together, but they just couldn't be seen doing it in public. So exactly when the first people would have played integrated is hard to know, but the first time, the time at the Congress Hotel was the first, major appearance. Yeah.
So you're pretty young, but I'm surprised that you dealt with all the current.
I could cover Nirvana living here for a while in the early 90s, yeah, but Yeah, I've already gotten over time. I can only get up to about 1965 with a brief foray into the 70s. Yeah, well, all of that stuff that all of the stuff in the 1990s grew out of the stuff in the 1960s and the 1950s. So,
What's the green?
the Green Mill.
Yeah.
What's the story with the Green Mill? The Green Mill loves to tell people that Al Capone hung out there. Al Capone probably never set foot in the place. And, you know, we've got that, like, there are videos where Earl Hines talks about, you know, Capone would come in and say, we want you to be like the three monkeys. You don't see nothing, you don't say nothing, you don't hear nothing. Whether Earl Father Hines is really telling the truth about this, I have no way of knowing. But he kept his stories pretty, it's always hard to actually pinpoint Capone anywhere, but you always hear Capone is supposed to have had his own booth at so many different places, like his own booth here, his own box at the theater. Capone did not show up in public very often. Too many people wanted to kill him. There's a show on Netflix right now, How to Become a Mob Boss, where I'm one of the talking heads. They were begging me when we were filming, like, you got to talk about when Capone had the press conference where he said that he was paying off McSwiggan. I'm like, but it wasn't a press conference. So they had, like, the animation was already done of Capone having the press conference on the courthouse steps. All those quotes came from one reporter she was brought in to see him through like 4 layers of bodyguards in the back room of a place. He was not the kind of guy who would announce that he was going to hold a press conference. Somebody would have shot him for sure if he tried something like that. Though during his trial, he did go to the Northwestern football game. And when things got dull during the game, they would just boo Al Capone a little more. They booed him when he came in, and every time things got slow, they'd boo him again.
You mentioned rag pickers and bone collectors.
Yeah.
Rag picker, I can understand. What did bone collect? Did they really go?
They'd sell them back to mills and glue factories and stuff, I imagine. It wasn't a lucrative job necessarily. And I wish there was more about this. Like Kid Ory said that Buddy Bolden stole from rag pickers on their tin horns right and left. Jelly Roll Morton talked about it a bit. When he was in the hospital in the 1950s, Louis Armstrong wrote a whole memoir of his time growing up with that Jewish family and talked about learning to play on the tin horn, learning to play different tunes on it, and how they helped him buy his first cornet. So we've got enough anecdotes that, you know, things don't just come out of nowhere. Like even Buddy Bolden he was picking up sounds that he heard on the street, the sounds that he heard in his life. And there's a few anecdotes about some of that coming from the rag and bone pickers playing their tin horns. And I found a number of other references where they say, where people refer to rag and bone pickers with their tin horns, not just in Chicago, or in New Orleans, but all over the place. But not enough really documented that we could really say much more about it. I think I can get like all of the quotes about it onto one page. But they're significant quotes. Yeah.
Well, I got a question about chess records. Was it the 70s that kind of was the demise of the end of the record?
I think the Chess Brothers sold it in the late 60s. Okay. And after that, it kind of fell apart, I think.
Yeah, I know Willie Dixon stayed.
Yeah, to the building. They moved into the building that they have now, they moved into in the late 50s. Like a little bit after Chuck Berry first started recording there. Yeah. Originally, the office at least was on 47th Street, and but then they moved to 2120 South Michigan in 57. It really kind of passed their prime by then. Other than the Chuck Berry stuff, the Chicago blues, something they noticed, like the younger black people weren't listening to blues. They thought it was their parents' music. They thought it was old-fashioned by then, even in the 50s. Yeah, but Muddy Waters would say to anybody who would listen, that's why I still have a career. Is people like that, people like Eric Clapton took him out on tour. Yeah. There's a whole other conversation to have about appropriation and things like this, but it's if nobody's appropriating you 20 years after your heyday, then you just kind of fade away.
It sounds like the South Side was very you mentioned Bronzeville.
Oh, yeah. Well, Bronzeville, they used to say that if you went on State Street and held up a horn, it would just start playing itself. There was so much music in the air at the time. All along the stroll. Yeah.
Did you mention the Harvard?
Oh, yeah, that was the Grand Terrace. Yeah, there's a picture in the packet, and I got a little out of order there, but there's a picture in the packet of the murals on the wall behind a bunch of beauty products. That's the old Grand Terrace where Earl Father Hines would play. Still there. It's a beauty shop now, but they've still got some of the murals from when it was a jazz club. It was a hardware store for a long time. It's now a yeah. Yeah. Yeah, they still got like the tour bus groups still show up there, people on the jazz trail and the blues trail. Yeah, mostly Europeans and Japanese too. There's this place out of the suburbs, there's like a Japanese jazz cafe. I can't remember which suburb it is. It's over by WTW. It's on Sunrise or Sunset or something. I went in there just because it was like the only convenient restaurant when I was doing Chicago Tonight, and it was like not a word of English even on the menu, but it's just jazz everything. They've got like Japanese jazz artists coming in all the time. Very interesting. It was like wandering into something out of a Daniel Pinkwater book, really. But... Nice Patty. No, I'm gonna be two fisting over here. Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. Well, you didn't let me see the bottom of it, so now I'm just untangling myself.
Yeah, no, it's cool. This is a good show, you know. Hey guys, thanks so much. Thank you guys all again so much for coming. Thank you for your patience while we figure out sound for 2024. For those of you that were watching our disjointed live stream, we'll have a clean video cut together all nicely for you, available next week. Or if you're here in person and you want to relive the magic, we always have recordings of our lectures. So if you learned something fantastic, you could always revisit, rewind, and catch up with what you learned. Thank you guys so much for being here. We do have seats open for next week's lecture on the history of poison control. And starting tonight, you can register for our lecture on the history of bicycles. So good stuff. Make sure you follow along. And Olivia in the red jumpsuit in the back has a tip jar for you, or again, feel free to donate online. Thank you guys so much.
Thanks, everybody.